Okay, in this module, we're going to shift a little bit. In previous modules, we spent a lot of time talking about stuff like mindset and metacognition and time management and so forth. But now we're going to go down into the weeds a little bit and take a look at some specific techniques that you can use to improve your metacognition, to ensure that you understand and think about your thinking. Okay? And so here's a picture here, and it says, what can you do differently that will make the biggest positive academic impact? Okay, and so on page 40 of the Dr. McGuire textbook, she's going to list a number of metacognitive activities that will help you improve um, your performance, right? And just understand that not every one of these is going to be applicable to you. So when you look at a list, you take a look at what stands out to you as the most probably impactful thing that you can do, and then try to adopt it. It's kind of like taking a golf lesson, right? I may be very good around the green. My short game may be great, and so what I need a lesson on is the tee box, the long ball, where somebody else may be great off the tee, but they're terrible around the green, and so they need to focus on their short game. So everybody's different. So look at this list and try to extract one or two metacognitive techniques that will be most impactful to you. Okay. Now, the key thing here is this idea of a paradigm shift. Okay, and what's a paradigm? Okay, a paradigm is a way of looking at something. Okay, so a paradigm shift is just a different way of looking at that whatever it is. And so I have some pictures here that show some of the biggest paradigm shifts that have occurred, certainly in your lifetime. The upper left picture is a smartphone, right? And many of you didn't know life without a smartphone. But it was a huge paradigm shift. What do I mean by that? How we took pictures completely changed. No more cameras, or seldom do we carry camera. How do we take videos? I used to carry around this big video camera to take videos of my kids. Nobody does that anymore. How we message each other, how we listen to music, how we entertain ourselves, how we play games, on and on and on. Everything changed when that smartphone came out. Companies struggled or went out of business because of this. New companies came into existence because of this paradigm shift. If you take a look at AI, to the right, you can see the Chat GPT, but I'm really talking about AI. And AI is going to so fundamentally change everything in ways that I'm not even sure I can comprehend, nor can anybody else. But in your lifetime, this is going to be extremely influential and a game changer. How you work, how you learn, everything's going to be affected by artificial intelligence. So be prepared for that paradigm shift. It's already happening. The other paradigm shift is tied here down at the bottom to COVID, right? On an instant, we had to shift the way we learned and the way we went to work because of COVID. And so things that didn't exist, Zoom, for example, I never heard of Zoom until within a month I became an expert at Zoom because I had to. I had to change my paradigm as to how am I going to teach a course when I can't be physically in front of my students. Okay. And so when a system is not working, that is how a paradigm shift begins. And then you got to take a look at, okay, how do I adapt? Well, what am I driving at? Well, the paradigm that we're talking about is the way that you have probably approached academics. The old paradigm that you used in high school, and I've adapted this from a business textbook. This is really about business paradigms, but it applies to academics. So your old paradigm that you used in high school was good enough, right? Whatever that paradigm was. But there is a paradigm shift. You have hit an inflection point going to college where the old paradigm probably is not going to work, right? And so if you don't make the adjustment, you can see the recognition. So now you're on that downward concavity, right? The inflection point, and you haven't changed. And you recognize, well, how do you recognize? Well, I'm not doing very well. I've failed my math test. My English writing is not up to snuff. I mean, there are going to be key indicators that things are not going the way you planned. And if you don't recognize and then make the adjustment, then you can see if you continue on that same paradigm, you're going to reach a critical point where it's kind of the point of no return that if you don't change, you're probably not going to be successful. And as we talked about the very first day, that 50% of college students don't graduate in 6 years. Okay, they are not adapting to the new paradigm of college. Okay, so the idea of things worked in high school, they'll work in college, probably is not going to be true. So what changes in college? Okay, well, there's no more getting away with studying the night before. There is no fail policy. We don't give you extra credit necessarily. We don't let you take exams over again because you didn't do well. And you got to devote a lot more time outside of the class to be successful. Okay? So college is a different paradigm than high school. And the sooner you realize this and the sooner you adapt, the better you're going to be. And so what are these adaptations? Well, this ties several of the concepts we've talked about. What am I going to study? Okay, so time management. You maybe never thought about it much before in high school, but you have got to set up some system to manage your study time. When am I going to study? Okay, and then you got to create an environment to succeed. You got to remove the distractions. You may think you can multitask, but we've already talked about that. You cannot do it. So get the right environment, and then the motivation, the mindset. How am I gonna be motivated to study something that I don't really want to do? Okay, so remember back to the first class or two when we talked about vision and mission, and we had you come up with a motivational quote or a picture. Okay, for me, my motivation to study wasn't because I really wanted to do math or physics or chemistry. It was because I wanted to be a pilot, and I didn't want to work in a factory, as I talked about earlier. So find your motivation. You're not going to love it, but you got to be motivated to do it. And then last, and what we focus on today, is how to study most effectively. Okay, this is the metacognition part. There are right ways to study, and there are wrong ways to study. And the sooner you recognize that, the better you're going to be. So, what is so hard about reading? Now, if I was to ask you, I would get many different answers, but I think most would probably come back and say something to the effect that both the quantity and the difficulty of the material makes it hard to stay focused on the subject. Okay? Everybody knows what highway hypnosis is. We've all experienced it. Well, we all suffer from reading hypnosis. We're reading something, and 10, 15 minutes into it, we stop and realize I've been looking at words in a book, but I have no idea what I just read. And so what do? You have to go back and you got to reread it. And 5 minutes in, you're back in the hypnotic state, and you're making zero progress. Okay, so there's some things that Dr. McGuire talks about, and on page 43 in her text, there's a fantastic exercise on the value of previewing. And I'm not going to tell you about it because you need to take it. I think it's a great example. But as an example of previewing, I'll talk about a movie that I saw several years ago. I think it was called Inception with Leonardo DiCaprio. And I don't know what it was that day. I was tired. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention. But I realized about halfway through the movie, I had no idea what was going on. It was just bizarre, and I'm like, I don't know what's going on. I have no clue. And so when the movie was over, I was a little frustrated, and so I looked up what was the movie Inception about, and I read this little synopsis of the movie, and all of a sudden I go, oh my gosh, it makes sense. And I rewatched the movie having read the synopsis, and it all made sense where it made no sense. And so the idea of previewing is to give you the context. You're looking at the write-up before you go down into the details. Okay, very, very effective exercise. Make sure you do that. There's the idea of paraphrasing the correct way, and you're going to read about it. But the idea of this is to avoid having to reread the text over and over again. The basic idea is you read a paragraph, you stop, You go, what did that paragraph just tell me? And you write a very brief 1 or 2 sentence synopsis on what was the point of that paragraph. And then you go, how did that tie into the previous paragraph? Because these things flow. And so you make that connection, and then you read the next paragraph and do the same thing. What did this paragraph tell me? How did it tie to the previous one? And by doing that, you avoid having to reread the text all the time. You avoid falling into reading hypnosis. Okay. And so that's what paraphrasing the correct way does. It avoids having to reread the text. A paradigm shift for me is this idea of e-texts. Obviously, I grew up in an era where there was no such thing. And so all of you have become used to e-texts, but there's a lot of tools that many of you don't know how to use. So this is an example from one of my math textbooks. They provide the ability to highlight. You can create notes. You can create flashcards. There's videos of different varieties. Wonderful tools, but they're of no use unless you use them, but use them specifically in a way that best benefits you. Flashcards, when you have to remember stuff, flashcards are great. If you remember the video on memorization, what did the memory champ talk about? You got to do it over and over and over again, right? And so flashcards are the way to remember stuff that you just got to remember. And it's repetition, but it works. Okay. And then, and here they're going to talk about different ways of learning and taking notes. And just understand that there is no one size fits all. Okay, so some classes, mind mapping, the idea of drawing pictures with connections and words that illustrate what the connections are wonderful because we are very visual people. We can remember visual things. I think it was just the last class I introduced you to my neighbors, right? And I showed you a picture. And if I was to ask every one of you, if you listened to that, I think every one of you would know the names of my neighbors, right? Robin and Ben, and I gave you the illustration of Big Ben with a robin sitting on the side of it. That's mind mapping. Okay, it's easy to remember if that is probably the best way to make these connections. Flashcards I just talked about. If you have to memorize stuff, they're wonderful. And then on the right, you can see some Cornell notes. What you don't want to do is just write a mini version of a textbook, right? Just a bunch of words. And so there are better ways to organize your notes, and the Cornell note system is one of them. So read about it. And again, your toolbox may be different than your neighbors. You've got to pick the tools out that are going to help you be most effective. Another kind of paradigm shift, if you will, is, back in my day, we went to class and all we had was taking notes. Okay. And then we would take those notes and we would go back and we had to read the textbook because the notes were a lot was missing. What you don't see here underneath the closed captioning is a C_T. And in the book, they're going to talk about this. What's the missing letter? C_T. Well, is it cat? Is it cot? Is it cut? I don't know. You don't know because unless you read the textbook, you're only getting part of the illustration through whatever instructor notes are provided, or if you're looking at PowerPoints, they are not the complete picture. So it is vitally important that you get the whole picture by taking a look at the textbook. It's very difficult to learn math unless you look and understand how to read a textbook. Okay? The other big mistake, especially, this is a STEM class, but virtually everybody has to take math courses, and most students do it wrong. We have this software that's wonderful to help you do math homework, but what do students do? They go right to the homework without reading the text because, yeah, it's boring and it's difficult. And so you're trying to prove that you understand something before you've learned it. And so what do many students do? They get in trouble. They use all this help that's over on the right side to help them get the green check mark. And they'll get the green check mark. Maybe it's an app, a math app that you just take a picture and it gives you the answer. And so students will go, "Hey, I got 100 on the homework," but the truth is they understood none of it. They didn't read the text. They didn't try to understand it. All they focused on was getting 100 on the homework. And then you go into a math exam and you think you're prepared. You have very poor metacognition, and in many cases, you don't do well. And you don't understand why. You're doing the homework wrong. Read the text, look at the examples, make sure you understand it. When you think you understand it, you go and do your homework. Okay? Take notes by hand. Okay? Take notes. A lot of students won't even take notes, period. But the idea of taking notes by hand, it requires you to actively listen and observe the instruction, and then you translate it into a form that you can write on paper. And this helps your brain process and understand what's being said and summarizes it in a way that you understand. Okay, I'm not talking about just copying something. We're talking about listening, trying to understand it, and then write it in a way that you can remember. Okay, this develops neural networks in the brain, and it helps you learn. So take notes, and then use those notes and your textbook to come up with a comprehensive set of notes that you can use to study. Okay, the best thing, this worked for me, and it'll work for you, is if you think you understand something or you want to test your knowledge, just pretend you're teaching it. And if you can explain it, you're good. If you cannot explain it, then you really don't understand it. When possible, get into groups. When I went through grad school, we had a group of about 10 guys. It was all guys, at that point, in computer science. And we got together in groups 3 nights a week. We helped each other. That explaining stuff that I understand and having somebody explain stuff that I didn't understand in a way different from the instructor was a fabulous way of learning. Okay. And probably the biggest thing I'll never understand is I give practice exams to my math students, and 50% of my students just never even do the practice exam. And guess what? Those are the 50% of students that typically don't do very well on the exams. My A students will often take the practice exam many times. The practice exams don't count in terms of a grade. It's a metacognitive tool that you can go, let me see if I understand the material without notes, without any aids. And if you don't understand something, if you get something wrong, then it highlights areas that you need to focus on. The poor students think they're prepared, so they blow it off, and then they come in and they don't do well. Okay? So as you go through this particular module, just pull out the tools that jump out at you as ways to be most effective and efficient in study. And again, it's not about working hard. You're going to work hard, but what more than that, you want to work smart. Okay? So good luck with this module. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys have to say in some of the submissions.